Every year when the snow starts piling up on the shoulders of I-75 and the radio slips into endless Christmas songs, I remember one night in Michigan that I would pay a lot of money to forget. I am 37 now, driving a decent car, wearing a clean coat, with a life that looks respectable from the outside. But 10 years ago on Christmas night, I was a broke 17-year-old kid in a dying neighborhood just outside Detroit, walking through freezing wind toward a job that paid me barely enough to keep the heat on in our apartment. That was the night I met the Grey Lady of Dudley Castle, thousands of miles from England, in a place where she should not have existed at all. Back then, I lived with my mom in a cramped upstairs unit off a side street in Dearborn, near an old industrial stretch that people in the city like to forget. Our furnace was stubborn, the kind that rattled and coughed for half an hour before admitting defeat. We blocked the windows with towels, wore hoodies indoors, and pretended we could not see our breath. Mom worked double shifts at a diner on Michigan Avenue. I had picked up whatever work I could find, and that Christmas, my job was night security and clean up at an abandoned factory complex by the Detroit River, a place everyone called Riverside Foundry, even though the sign out front had lost half its letters. They gave me a second-hand security jacket, a ring of keys, and a battered phone that barely held a charge. My task was simple: walk the corridors, check the doors, watch the cameras from a cramped office that smelled like burnt coffee and mouse droppings, call the supervisor if anyone broke in. The complex had once belonged to an English industrialist who came over in the early 20th century to build engines and metal parts. There was even a little brick chapel on the grounds, tucked between two warehouses, built for the workers who came from England. No one used it anymore. The windows were boarded up and the door was chained shut. Locals said it was unlucky to get too close. It was already dark when I crossed the parking lot that night. The wind coming off the river cut straight through my jacket. It was Christmas, but there were no lights here, no carols, just the constant hum of the highway and the crunch of my boots on ice. My breath blew out in white bursts as I fumbled with the keys and let myself into the main building. Inside, the air felt dead and heavy, the way abandoned places always do. Every sound was too loud. Every footstep came back at you from 3 different directions. In the security office, I flipped on the monitors. The cameras were old, black and white, with a habit of flickering at random. Grainy images of long corridors, loading bays, stairwells, and that little brick chapel filled the screen. The chapel camera was mounted high on a pole, aimed at the door and the narrow path leading up to it. Nothing moved, just drifting snow and the dark shape of the building. I remember pulling my phone out and opening YouTube to keep myself awake. A few days earlier, I had fallen down a rabbit hole of English ghost stories and castle hauntings. One video stuck in my head. It was about Dudley Castle in England and its famous Grey Lady. The host talked about guards who saw her floating through the corridors around Christmas, always near the old chapel where prisoners once prayed before execution. Then they showed the 1999 security camera footage. A staircase, a doorway, and a pale, misty shape of a woman in an old-fashioned dress, turning as if she heard someone calling her. People had argued for years about whether it was real. That video bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Sitting in that cold Michigan factory office 10 years ago, with the snowstorm outside and the hum of the fluorescent light above me, I searched for that same clip again. I watched it twice. The way the woman seemed to glide, the way the guards in interviews swore they saw her every Christmas around midnight near that chapel door in Dudley Castle. I told myself it was just something weird with the camera. Glitch, dust, whatever made sense. I was too tired and too broke to believe in ghosts. Around 11:30, I started my rounds. I zipped up my jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped back into the hallway. The concrete floor was slick and cold. My flashlight beam stretched ahead in a narrow tunnel of white. I passed rows of empty offices, metal hooks with no coats, bulletin boards with faded safety posters. Somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal banged against a wall in the wind. The first hour was uneventful, just me and the building breathing around me. But as midnight crept closer, something in the air shifted. The temperature dropped hard. My fingers burned even through my gloves. I could hear the wind screaming outside, then suddenly nothing at all. No highway noise, no distant sirens, just silence so complete it pressed against my ears. I turned a corner toward the side exit that led out to the chapel courtyard. The small window in the fire door showed a sliver of the brick building, its roofline heavy with snow. My breath fogged the glass. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing near the chapel door. A pale blur, almost like someone in a long coat. I wiped the window with my sleeve and looked again. Nothing, just snow and bricks. I told myself I was jumpy because of that Dudley Castle video and moved on. When I got back to the security office, the monitors flickered in unison. For a moment, all the screens went black, then came back with a harsh static before settling. One screen did not match the others. The camera pointed at the chapel showed something I knew had not been there before. A figure. She stood on the narrow path leading to the chapel door. A woman in what looked like a long grey dress that moved in some invisible breeze, even though the snow around her was still. There was no detail, just the impression of cloth, a veil. The suggestion of a face turned sideways. She was not sharp like a real person on camera. She was too light, too thin, almost like the image had been drawn over the screen. I froze with my hand still on the doorframe. My heart started hammering in my chest. I leaned closer to the monitor. The timestamp in the corner read 11:56 p.m., December 25th. She did not move at first. She just stood there in front of the chapel. The same angle as the figure in the 1999 Dudley Castle footage I had watched earlier. Then slowly, she glided forward, stopping at the chapel door. There was no movement of her feet. She just floated. I grabbed the phone and called my supervisor. It went straight to voicemail. I almost laughed because suddenly it felt like every bad horror movie I had ever seen. I told myself it was a trick of the camera, some old recording looping by mistake. But the snow falling around her was real time. I could see it drifting past, sticking to the path, forming a thin sheet over the figure that never accumulated on her dress. The chapel door on the screen was chained shut and padlocked. I knew that. I had checked it earlier that evening. On the monitor, the grey lady stopped in front of it, then turned very slowly, as if she was looking straight into the camera. For a heartbeat, I could swear her face had eyes, hollow and dark, but full of something that felt like a mix of sorrow and warning. My skin went cold all over. I should have stayed in that chair and ignored it. That was the smart move. Instead, for reasons I still do not fully understand, I grabbed my flashlight and the key ring and headed out toward the chapel. The hallway felt different. Each fluorescent tube snapped and buzzed overhead, dimmer than before. The building smelled of old dust and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. My boots sounded too loud on the floor. Every step bounced back at me in lonely echoes. At the side exit door, I hesitated, hand on the bar. The narrow window showed only swirling snow. No figure, no chapel, just white. I pushed the door open anyway, and an Arctic blast hit me full in the face, tearing the air from my lungs. I stepped out into the courtyard. The chapel sat maybe 30 yards away. A squat brick building, dark and hunched under the weight of snow. The path was half buried. The wind clawed at my jacket and tried to push me back, but the air was unnaturally quiet between gusts, like the noise was being swallowed before it could form. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Halfway there, everything changed. The wind cut off. The flakes falling around me seemed to slow, as if the whole night were holding its breath. The air temperature dropped again, a sudden plunge that felt like walking into a freezer. My exhale turned into thick white clouds that hung in front of my face. Then the footsteps started. They were not mine. Mine were heavy and muted by the snow. These were sharp, precise, like high heels striking stone instead of frozen ground. Click, 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 slowly circling me, although nothing visible moved. The sound bounced off the walls of the warehouses, closing in. I swung the flashlight around, the beam jerking across bricks and snow and shadow. No one was there. I wanted to turn back. I did not. Pride, stupidity, curiosity, it all mixed together. I forced my legs to keep moving until I reached the chapel door. Up close, it looked even more abandoned. Chains wrapped around the metal handles, secured by a rusting padlock. A small plaque was bolted to the brick beside it, nearly obscured by ice. I scraped it with my glove until I could read the words. Riverside Workers Memorial Chapel. Dedicated 1911 to the men and women lost in service and accident, built in gratitude by Sir Henry T. Dudley and the English community of Detroit. That name hit me like a slap. Dudley. My brain tried to connect the dots. Dudley Castle, Sir Henry Dudley, English community. I remembered something I had read online about rich industrialists shipping stone and stained glass from old churches and estates in England to build their new lives in America. For a second, I imagined part of Dudley Castle itself tucked into the walls in front of me, halfway across the world. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I reached out to touch the chain. It was ice cold, colder than the air, so cold it burned through my glove. Then I noticed something wrong. The padlock hung open. The loop was not threaded through the end link. The chains were draped more than locked. Someone had made it look sealed without actually securing it. My mouth went dry. Very carefully, I eased the chain aside. The chapel door groaned when I pulled it. The sound long and low and full of years. A breath of air rolled out, colder than the night, carrying the smell of damp stone and old candle wax. For a moment, I thought I heard whispering. Not English like we speak now, but softer, formal like church prayers from an old recording. I stepped inside. The interior was lit only by the weak glow of my flashlight. Pews stood in narrow rows, their wood cracked and warped. The floor was a patchwork of stone slabs, darkened by age. At the far end stood a simple altar, dust thick on its surface. Behind it, a high arched window had once held stained glass, now boarded over. The air wrapped around me like icy fingers. Then I saw her. She was kneeling in front of the altar, facing away from me. A woman in a long grey gown that blended with the shadows. Her head covered by a veil that floated lightly even though there was no breeze inside. Her shoulders rose and fell in tiny motions, like someone silently sobbing. My flashlight beam passed through her edges, but her form was still there, clear enough that my brain could not label it as a trick of light. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but some part of me was locked in place, pinned to the stone, like another ghost among many. "Ma'am," I managed, my voice shaking, "you should not be in here." She stopped moving. For a long second, nothing happened. Then she began to turn. Not like a normal person, shifting weight and rotating. It was as if the whole image pivoted slowly in the air. First her shoulders, then her neck, then her veiled face angled toward me. My light hit her front, and behind the thin grey fabric I saw the vague impression of features, washed out and pale, the suggestion of eyes that were far too dark and far too deep. The temperature dropped again. My teeth started chattering. Her mouth moved. There was no sound at first. I thought I was seeing things until a whisper finally reached me, thin as smoke and coming from everywhere at once. "Not here." My chest tightened. "What?" I whispered back, though I already felt the answer. "Not this way." The words seemed to bounce off the stone, echoing inside my skull rather than in the room. At the same time, an overwhelming wave of emotion hit me. Not anger, not hatred, sorrow, crushing and old. The feeling of people who knew they were not walking out of a place alive. The prisoners at Dudley Castle, the workers memorialized in this chapel, all layered on top of each other in a single suffocating moment. Another sound cut through it, a sharp crack from somewhere above. I glanced up. A deep fracture was racing across one of the wooden beams in the ceiling, splitting it in two. Dust poured down in a sudden shower. The beam groaned, shifted, then snapped. Everything moved at once. I dove backward, hitting the stone floor hard. The beam crashed down where I had been standing seconds earlier, smashing a pew to splinters. More plaster rained from the ceiling. The entire chapel shuddered like it had been hit by an invisible fist. Pain shot up my arm. My flashlight skidded away and rolled, casting crazy, spinning shadows. In one of those wild arcs of light, I saw her again. The grey lady stood beside the fallen beam now, not crushed, not displaced. Her veil was still, but her head was tilted in my direction, watching me with that same unreadable expression. Then the light flickered and she was gone. The next thing I remember clearly is lying in the snow outside with paramedics leaning over me. My ears rang, my arm throbbed. Red and blue lights flashed against the side of the factory buildings. One of the EMTs kept telling me to stay awake, while another shone a small light into my pupils. "Kid, you are lucky," a man's voice said. I turned my head and saw my supervisor standing there, wrapped in a heavy coat, his face pale. The camera feed cut out for a second, and when it came back, there was dust everywhere in that chapel. Thought someone had broken in. When I called you, you did not answer. We called 911, half the ceiling collapsed. Half. If you had been a few steps forward, they would be pulling you out, not patching you up. I wanted to tell him about the woman. I wanted to say that something had warned me, pulled me back at exactly the right moment. Instead, I just nodded and let them load me into the ambulance. A week later, Riverside Foundry shut down completely. The owners declared the buildings unsafe and ordered them sealed. The chapel was demolished a few months after that. I never went back. I took it as a sign. I enrolled in community college, took night classes, and slowly worked my way towards something better. It was not easy. I was still poor for a long time. But I never forgot that voice in the chapel saying, "Not this way," in a tone that felt like a verdict and a blessing at the same time. Years passed. I clawed my way into a decent job, then a better one. I built a career in logistics, working long hours, saying yes to things other people turned down. Eventually, I ended up where I am now, with a glass-walled office high above downtown Detroit, looking out at the river and the cold metal bones of the Ambassador Bridge. People see the view and think I'm lucky. They do not know how close my story came to ending on the floor of a crumbling chapel nobody remembers. Sometimes late at night, when the building is almost empty and the janitor's carts squeak down the halls, I pull up that old 1999 Dudley Castle footage again, the one with the grey lady in the doorway of the chapel. I freeze the frame where she turns toward the camera and compare it to what I remember from Michigan. The tilt of the head, the drape of the dress, the way the figure seems to exist halfway between places. I cannot prove they are the same. I just know they feel the same. There is one thing that bothers me more than the footage, though. Last year on Christmas night, I stayed late at the office to finish a report. The snow was heavy, smearing the lights of Windsor and Detroit into blurry streaks across the glass. When I stood up to stretch, I caught my own reflection in the window. A tired man in a dress shirt, tie loosened, the city behind him. Then I noticed something over my shoulder. A second shape in the reflection, faint, almost invisible, standing just behind my right side, the outline of a woman in grey, head slightly bowed as if in prayer. I spun around. The office was empty. When I looked back at the glass, she was gone. Only my own reflection stared back. People ask me sometimes what pushed me to get out of that neighborhood, out of that life. They expect me to say my mom, or ambition, or fear of ending up like the guys on the corner. In a way, they are right. But the truth is, on one Christmas night in Michigan, something older and sadder than anything I had a name for pulled me out of the path of a falling ceiling and turned me toward a future I did not think I deserved. Ever since then, every time the bells of the churches along Woodward Avenue ring on Christmas and the snow starts burying the city again, I cannot help looking at any glass surface near me, just in case. Because part of me is convinced that somewhere between Dudley Castle and Detroit, the Grey Lady still remembers the poor 17-year-old boy she warned in that frozen chapel, and that she is still making sure I do not try to follow the path that was meant for the dead.